Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Like many of you, I'm guessing, I've been watching the new mini-series on Netflix, Ripley, featuring Andrew Scott. I'm not sure what I think of it. The production values are incredibly high. The acting is of very high quality. I think I'd rather be in a movie theater, but maybe I'm just an old fuddy-duddy on that front. One of the things that intrigues me about Netflix's Ripley is the business model. Clearly, it must have cost an enormous amount of money to produce, getting Scott, enormously sophisticated camera work and other acting, but I'm not sure how many new Netflix subscribers it generates. My guest today might be able to answer some of those questions. Daniel Bessner is an intellectual historian at the University of Washington, and he has the cover story on this month's Harper's Magazine, The Life and Death of Hollywood. Film and television writers face an existential crisis. If I had $1 for every time one crisis or another, Daniel, in America was called existential, I wouldn't need to be doing this podcast. Tell me more about Scott's Ripley. I mean, how does it work? You spent a year on this story, so you're familiar with these business models. What's going on here?
Sure. I actually haven't watched the Ripley show yet, but I'm a fan of the movie.
And I wouldn't necessarily advise it. I'm not sure if it's particularly good, but that's another matter.
Andrew Scott's good.
Exactly. Well, that's why I was watching
it. People seem to like it. I in the sense of how it works, I mean, Netflix is kind of in a different category than the other streamers. Netflix is by far the most successful streamer. It is profitable and quite profitable, and effectively, to some degree, not totally, its monopoly play was successful. But I think you basically laid out the long and short of it. At least for most of Netflix's history, the idea was that you would do interesting, oftentimes splashy shows, with a bunch of other shows, one might add, that weren't as interesting and weren't as splashy, as a means to increase your subscriber base, because the gamble that Netflix and later other streamers made was that increasing one's subscriber base, first in the United States and abroad, would be the means to effectively turn a streaming service into, the goal being, of course, Amazon or, an Uber or a Lyft, where everyone would go to stream their product. But very interestingly, just in the last few days, Netflix has announced that it's no longer going to focus on subscribers, but it's going to focus on profit. So apropos of my piece, I think my piece really appeared at a fortuitous time, because it's kind of the end of a particular historical period in Hollywood, the so-called streaming wars.
You're not for better or worse, a Hollywood guy, Daniel. You're based in Seattle. You teach at the University of Washington, but you spent a year of your life, according to an ex-post on this. Tell me how you researched this. Were you commuting up and down to Hollywood from Seattle? Lots of flights from into LAX?
Well, last year I was on sabbatical in Los Angeles.
So you were there, so you didn't have to fly in and out.
Didn't have to fly in and out. So my academic research focuses, my first book focused in part on the Rand Corporation, which is based in Santa Monica. And my current research focuses on the early military industrial complex, when it came to airplanes, most of which was headquartered in Los Angeles. So I was there doing research for that project. And, when you're in LA, you bump up against Hollywood, you bump up against fellow writers. And when I was there, the strike was going on. Of course. Actually, the strike happened toward the end of my sabbatical year. And
this is the writer's strike, of course.
Yes, the writer's strike, which was followed by the SAG-AFTRA strike. The writer's strike began on May 2nd, 2023. It was called on May 1st, May Day. So I was there, and, I have a bunch of friends who are writers. I became closer and closer with them, done some writing myself in various fields. Ultimately, I consider myself a writer more than an academic. And in terms of academics, I have long been interested in intellectuals, and writers are a species of intellectuals. And the social role of the intellectual in the 20th century is probably my primary focus. So it's actually not as distant as it might appear if someone was familiar with my work. Not that anyone should be. So I did many interviews somewhere in the late 30s with film executives, writers, other scholars, to try to place the recent political economy of Hollywood in a much longer term context than is usually done. The piece begins in the 20s, even if most of it focuses from the period from the 1980s onward. So that's basically how it came together.
Yeah, the themes that you cover in the piece, it's an excellent piece, I thought.
Thank you.
On winner take all economy, monopolization, control from above, disempowerment of creatives. I mean, it works on lots of different economic models. It's certainly the Silicon model, the Silicon Valley model. But before we get to that, so what was it like meeting with studio executives? Are they as obnoxious as we often think? Did they chomp on cigars?
No, that studio executive doesn't exist anymore. Hollywood, like the rest of the creative economy, has been totally professionalized. Everyone there has a college degree, sometimes an advanced degree.
Can't you
And
be professional and still chomp on a cigar?
there's unfortunately, at least in my experience, much less cigar chomping than there would have been like by a Louis B. Mayer in the 1930s or a Jack Warner. It's professionalized. It's not that sort of garment industry vibe that it had for much of its 20th century history, like the rest of the political economy of the United States. And like journalism, like academia, like other fields, these are professionals, many of whom again have MBAs even. So they're executives, like you can imagine, thoughtful, very smart, especially because the people who go into Hollywood usually love movies and TV, because honestly, it's not that great a business. If you really wanted to just make money, you would go into finance or management consulting, even though McKinsey's now firing everyone as well. I like all the executives. They're pretty good people, and they're pretty sincere people. And I think most of them don't really love the political economy that they're in right now, because frankly, a lot of them are going to get fired. It's not like this is, even though the piece focused on writers, the broad contraction in Hollywood is going to result in an enormous number of people on the business side getting laid off, and they're not going to be able to remain in Hollywood. They're going to have to go into other careers.
So they're not like the dinosaurs who were surprised by the meteor. These people expect it. They know that in the end they're dead. In the long run,
in the long run, we're all dead. John Maynard Keynes. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like Harvey Weinstein, I think who you're referring to is just like a very different generation of the people who actually run Hollywood today.
Yeah, hopefully,
even though,
right.
yeah, even though like the rest of the economy, I would imagine, I haven't done enough research on this, but I imagine like the highest order of executives, they're a gerontocracy. You know, how old is someone like Bob Iger? I don't know. I imagine he's at least in his late 70s, 73. So he's in his early 70s. It's pretty old to be running a mega corporation. And so I imagine that's relatively true, although I don't know. But no, the executives I spoke to were not surprised. They were not sanguine about their industry, and it's a depressing place to work, because it's so obvious what's going on, and it feels like the rest of the American political economy, you can't do anything about it. So what my friend Karl Marx predicted has come true. The system is running.
I was going to bring up your friend Karl Marx. Is this part? I mean, is Hollywood? To borrow a Marxist term, is it epiphenomenal out of this late, what some people, they've been calling it for centuries, late capitalist economics?
Yeah, they've been calling that for about a century. I remember first coming across the term in the 1920s in German, Spit Kapitalismus. So that's where I know that it at least goes back to the 1920s, if not earlier. I don't think we're in late capitalism. I think we're just in unregulated capitalism. And I think precisely what Marx predicted has come true, which is that the system, if it wasn't basically controlled by humans, it would start functioning almost independently. The way that I kind of jokingly put it is that Skynet has become self-aware. So it seems like there's no way that we could control capitalism. It appears totally natural. What Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. And I think this actually explains a lot of social pathology. I mean, why do all the billionaires want to go to space? It's because even at their level of power, they're not even able to shape the system. So I think Hollywood, one of the reasons that I was interested in the piece itself, I of course wanted to learn about the industry. But another reason is that I I think it's a microcosm of what's going on in the entire political economy, particularly in creative fields like journalism and to some extent academia, even though academia is less affected directly by asset management companies, private equity firms, and hedge funds. There is a shaping there. So I think you're totally right. It's really about the entire American political economy and not just Hollywood.
So, of course, Marx famously said, we make our own histories, but not quite as we want. And this is certainly the case with the heroine of your piece, a young woman. I'm not sure how young she is now. I guess she's 42, so she's no longer young. A woman called Alina Smith. Tell me about Smith, how you met her, and what her story tells us about the existential crisis of Hollywood.
Sure. I met Elena through friends a few years ago at this point. And she's very charming, very charismatic, and a very talented writer. She was a playwright who came to Hollywood during the kind of beginning to middle period of prestige television. She worked on a couple of shows. I believe she worked on The Newsroom by Aaron Sorkin, and she worked on The Affair. And I believe one of her friends from Yale, if I'm getting this correct, I believe her name was Sarah Treem, but apologies if I got that wrong, helped get her into the room of The Affair. And then she was given her own show to do a show about Emily Dickinson. And it's really paradigmatic of this moment.
Called Dickinson.
Called Dickinson. Yeah,
and we'll
it's a
get
good
to
show.
Dickinson in a minute. But hadn't Alina Smith done her history? Hadn't she read about the Fitzgeralds? Who
oh, you mean like the playwrights? Had she done a history of all the money the writers who had previously come to Hollywood have made? I mean, there's that famous letter from Herb Mankiewicz to his friend Ben. I forget the name, Ben Freeman, something like that. But basically saying, come out to Hollywood. You could get, I think it was $250, $400. I haven't done the research in a couple of, it's a couple months. You file a piece and then it's out. But a fair bit of money for the 1920s. Come out to Hollywood. Everyone here is a moron, and you'll basically get paid a lot of money. I don't think Elena or I think that anyone's a moron. This is when Hollywood was a much more inchoate industry. But yeah, I mean, Hollywood's great if you're a writer, particularly during the era of prestige TV.
But when I mean, we all know, or I assume, that when you get into bed with Hollywood, there are going to be consequences. So when Alina Smith gave up her career writing theater in New York and came out to Hollywood, she couldn't have expecting the streets to be paved with gold, was she?
No, of course not. She's I know her. She's very smart and not naive at all, and quite realistic about the situation. Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely correct. But I think that particular norms, particular cultures had developed over the course of Hollywood history that essentially just devalues labor, devalues creative work. I mean, one side of if you just look at it purely macroeconomically, one side of the business is hyper organized, the capital side, and even though the other side of the business have unions, everyone's essentially an independent contractor. So in that situation, obviously power is going to accrue to the business side, and it's not surprising that the business has far more power than individual creatives.
So with Alina Smith, again, to borrow some famous words from Marx, was history just repeating itself? I mean, generation after generation of creatives have come to Hollywood being promised huge wealth, huge creative power, and the story has always ended badly. It's never had a Hollywood ending. Is it any surprise that the Alina Smith story ended sadly? And we'll talk about how it ended.
I mean, I don't know.
What's different about this?
I'm not sure the surprise. I would frame it as surprise, but like any historical phenomenon, there's continuities and changes, right? So, like you said, there are continuities. People coming out to Hollywood, not being so satisfied with the system and getting frustrated with it, and then continuing on in the system or leaving. But there's also changes because I just think that financialization and conglomeration were just not that is an artifact. Conglomerations an artifact of the 1980s and really the 1990s and beyond, and financializations an artifact of the post 2008 period, and those create different incentives and different structures, and so that is the big change. And so the degree to which financialization of not only Hollywood but the American political economy will actually shape businesses, I think is a change. I do think that there's going to be a serious contraction. I think that there's going to, just to use a term that everyone knows, a form of deindustrialization. If deindustrialization came for blue collar workers in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, it's essentially coming for white collar workers. Again, in Hollywood, but also I think it's coming for lawyers. I think it's coming for the ad industry. I think it's coming for the marketing industry. I think it's coming for first the people who majored in the humanities and then went into professions, and it'll eventually come for the people who majored in STEM. But it's also coming for them. I mean, do you realize you don't hear people say learn to code? That's because a lot of code any longer. That's because a lot of coding has been automated, and it'll be further automated by artificial intelligence. So we're coming to a large crisis point in the political economy as a whole, where you're going to need fewer and fewer workers, fewer and fewer laborers,
you
working
wrote
for less and less time.
and I'm going to get to this after the break. You asked in a piece you wrote for Harper's, I think it was last year,
cover story.
Yeah, what comes after the American century, and maybe it's the AI century, but we'll get to that. But before we do, I want to get to the break in a minute. Daniel, tell me what happened. So the heroine of the story, Alina Smith, comes to Los Angeles, comes to Hollywood. She makes this highly successful. She pioneers, writes, develops this highly successful show, Dickinson. But the story doesn't end well. What happens?
Well, as in Elena's telling, and I have no reason to doubt it, it's that basically the company didn't treat her great. They asked her to do a lot of work without guaranteeing green light. They didn't have
which company is this?
This is Apple. Apple and the studio that she worked for.
Surprise, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just you could read the details in the article, but they weren't especially forthcoming. They weren't especially open. They weren't especially transparent because, of course, why would you be, right? Unless you're forced to by the government or by union deal. Of course, the business side wants to retain all of its power and all of its knowledge, because knowledge, particularly when you're trying to do things like negotiate deals, when your deal comes up, is powerful. So I think that's basically the long and the short of that story. And what I liked about it, why I opened the article with it, is because I think it gave a good perspective on who has the power in the situation. That even if you're a showrunner, even if you're making a great show that's critically acclaimed and highly watched, you still basically have very little ultimate business authority and power. And that's because and it's interesting. I just want to say, I don't even blame the executives, because of course, why would you give up power in a capitalist system? They need to be regulated, or they need to make, or the WGA needs to advocate for a particular situation with regarding data transparency. But I think that incident really showed the divergence of power between creatives and the business class.
Some people might read the piece. As I said, I thought it was a very good piece. It wasn't entirely clear what happened with Alina Smith, but Apple understandably wanted to work really hard, and she worked harder and harder. And in the end, she quit. She had lots of alternatives. She could have just done her own startup. She could have found, couldn't she have found alternative support? I guess she'd lost the IP on Dickinson.
Well, Elena's doing fine. I mean, anyone could do something different. I mean, I don't understand that. Like she could have become a lawyer or a management consultant. I mean, she wanted to work in Hollywood.
But my point is that she quit because she didn't like Apple as an employer, right? Basically.
Well, I think she found it too stressful to work under not great working conditions for years and years, as any worker. I mean, I don't blame workers for that.
But she was very well paid. Was she?
I'm not going to comment on her.
What you imply in the piece that she was. I mean,
you could look at showrunner. You could look at writer minimums. They're well done. But so is the idea being, if you're well paid, you shouldn't be treated well?
I didn't say that. Maybe.
I mean, this is like the argument. Okay, so people are well paid.
We can find an Apple exec to argue that. I mean, we need the Apple case on this, but I don't want to get stuck with that. Let's take a break. I
wouldn't blame App. I mean, they're just being capitalists. Like that's what capitalists do.
But again, Daniel, to come back to the question I asked earlier, is this really that different from the various struggles between writers and studios?
No,
I mean, the Mankiewicz
the difference is
reveals that.
The difference is the type of show being made in the context that it's being made. No, but you're absolutely right. For a very long time, one might say the entire history of Hollywood, the business side has had more power than the creative side.
And it's true of all creative. I mean, you've written.
That's true of all capitalism.
Publishing. Well, not just capitalism, but the
Miners
publishing
had less
business,
power than the mine owner. I mean, this is just capitalism, and
right?
it
Or the
reproduces
publishing
itself. Yeah,
business. I mean, I don't know
yeah,
how
yeah,
many
yeah.
books you've written. Books. I mean, you work for Harper's. I'm sure there's an arrangement in terms of them paying you something. You put a year. I mean, you put a year of your work into this,
Yes,
Daniel. How much did you get for this article?
millions of dollars.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah,
probably, you know, I'd be surprised if you got more than a couple of grand. That's not a year's worth of work, is it?
I do it for the love of the game.
Ah, post-revolutionary society. We are
I
talking
try
with
to live the society I'm in.
I want to remind everyone that, like Harper's, Liberty's done a wonderful job covering our culture. It's Quarterly Journal of Culture and Politics. They help support, speaking of money, help support this show, Keen On. Going to run a short feature, and then we'll be back with Daniel to talk more about Hollywood and perhaps a post-capitalist economy. I also want to talk about AI, so we'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. There are lots and lots of magazines. There's Harper's, there's Liberties, there's many others. But according to my guest, Daniel Bessner, the author of The Life and Death of Hollywood, there's only 4 companies in the creative business in Hollywood, which is increasingly movies and TV. Is that the problem, Daniel, ultimately? That we have this monopolization, and those 4 will eventually become 3 or 2, I'm guessing.
That's the fear. I just want to say I was mentioned in the first issue of Liberties by Eli Lake. Not so unfavorably, but definitely unfavorably. Yeah, I mean, this is
a sort of a neocon type.
Eli is a neocon type. That is a fair description of Eli.
I heard him on the Andrew Sullivan show. He sounds a little over the top, but maybe we can get him on the show. Is he a friend of yours?
No.
They're not an enemy either.
Not, I mean, an ideological enemy, but I have nothing personally against Eli. But yes, no, I think you're right. I think the problem is that conglomeration as a result of Reagan era deregulation, which was then heightened under Clinton, plus financialization, which was a product of, the Bush and Obama administrations, have allowed already large conglomerates to become much, much larger. I mean, famously, Disney has purchased many companies over the last 15 to, at this point, maybe like 18, 19 years. They purchased Pixar, I believe, before the 07-08 crash, but since then they've purchased Lucasfilm, they've purchased Marvel, and so they've become this gigantic corporation, and there's just fewer and fewer buyers in Hollywood. And again, it's just what you always see with monopolization, and we have a very weak government that is unwilling to basically regulate these industries.
And how do the big players in Silicon Valley fit in? I mean, you've already mentioned Apple, which is could eat a Disney a day, probably a
sure
$3 trillion company. Amazon, which is invested in Hollywood. Google, which, like a huge shark, is always circling around these waters. What is the relationship between?
Sure.
And a lot of people have written about this, but it's a very interesting, complicated one. The relationship. It's a California relationship between Silicon Valley and Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important relationship. Like you said, Apple and Amazon decided to do their own production studios recently. And unlike the other companies, it's not their major business. And so they could lose a lot of money on these products, and it doesn't really matter. They're trying to get people into the Apple or the Amazon ecosystem. And probably, though, the most important element of tech in Hollywood is the idea that Netflix presented itself as a tech company, that it was going to, again, make the monopoly play for an Uber or like an Uber or an Amazon, and that it was able to attract an enormous amount of Wall Street interest and investment due to that very reason. And I don't think Netflix really isn't a tech company. It's just kind of a traditional media company operating in a new sphere. And I mean, you got to hand it to Netflix. They were incredibly successful far more successful than any of the other streamers. And to some degree, not totally, because I don't think you can have the same sort of monopoly play in Hollywood that you can have in, let's say, the taxi industry, which is a duopoly like FedEx and UPS is for shipping, or like Amazon is effectively a monopoly right now, though it competes with Walmart to some degree. You can't really have that sort of monopoly in Hollywood for a variety of reasons, but Netflix has been like incredibly successful. But it came, once every other studio and company tried to copy them, it came at the cost of an incredibly successful cable business, which was just like basically an almost socialist business where profits were to some degree distributed, that were made by carriage fees and ad sales
and benefited the
fees,
post
blah, blah,
office as well, the old industries. And you're
Yeah.
right, on Netflix, it's a very interesting company. No one's ever really written a book about Netflix as a kind of weird model, as an alternative model.
It's not. It's just a media company that basically tricked.
But it's a media company that has continually sort of jumped the shark, so to speak, eluded these big fish, bigger fish.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, one of the things I think the other studios and streamers were quite naive, because the history of Hollywood is littered with basically other companies that tried to disrupt the business and failed. Netflix did it. Netflix really disrupted the business, and it won in a serious way. And so there's true capitalist business genius there. There are so many failures in Hollywood history, and it wasn't a failure. It was a mega success, and it totally changed the entire.
Right, and we're all on Netflix. It's still an amazing deal, even if they've tightened up on who has access to different people's accounts. What is it, $10, $15, $20, all you can eat? Daniel, in all the doom and gloom and about Hollywood and this supposedly existential crisis, I mean, in all seriousness, the consumer's doing pretty well. I mean, we get to watch as many Ripleys and Dickinsons as we want. So,
I don't know about that. I actually disagree with that.
Golden age of television. I
want to
disagree with that.
There are two separate points there. I want to disagree with that. I actually think that it's really important to have mediating figures and mediating institutions. Like, you probably grew up in the age of like the record store, right? Where you would go to a record store.
Are you ageifying me, Daniel?
I would never do that. But you probably grew
up. I have been into a vinyl record store.
You have been into a vinyl record store, and there were record store people.
They've been reinvented. There's been a renaissance or a
yes,
rebirth.
There has been quite nice. I really think that that there's an important mediating cultural institutions and mediating cultural people. If you think about the prototypical 80s and 90s video store or record store, where there would be people who are really passionate about something, and they would get people into new types of art. That was good for the consumer, but also for those people themselves, because not everyone's going to be a successful director, but someone could kind of serve a really important cultural function. Those businesses, except for record stores, which have made a small renaissance recently, have basically gone away. So you've lost these mediating figures and these mediating institutions. So essentially now we have a shotgun shell approach to culture, where Netflix dumps things. Your algorithm, which is personally geared towards you, shows you what you might like. And so the algorithm is kind of functioning like a record store person, but it's not human. And so there's going to be things, at least I think philosophically, almost ontologically, missed there. So I don't think the consumer always benefits. And then there's always the problem of choice fatigue, where there's just so much stuff that it's very difficult to know what to actually watch. So you wound up being put into these silos that actually might not be so great for the consumer, at least in my opinion. And there was a second part to your question, which I also disagreed with, but would you mind repeating it?
I can't remember what it was. Yeah, I have to say, too much choice when it comes to good quality movies or television is not, it shouldn't be a problem. I mean, aren't we all adult enough to think through the silos and the algorithms?
No, I don't think that's how human beings work. No, I don't think that's correct. I mean, I don't think that's right. I think people oftentimes find it difficult to make adventurous choices, particularly when there's not a human element there. And I mean, choice fatigue is just a thing. I mean, I just disagree, but good people can disagree about this.
We can. So I forgot the other question. Let's move on. Since we've been talking Marx, let's talk Lenin. He famously asked, "What is to be done?" You end on a vaguely positive note about IP, but before we actually get there, talk about AI and why. I mean, you talk about the existential threat of monopoly Hollywood. Surely AI is the biggest threat of all, isn't it?
I think the union made a really good gain, which is basically you can't credit AI. So that's pretty good. But I think AI, what it's going to effectively do when it comes to writing, and we could talk about writing, but and if you want to talk about other things, let's talk about that. But it's gonna get rid of stages of development, I think. So you're going to have, let's say, Netflix purchase an AI program that is going to train. Probably there'll be different AI programs for different genres. And it's going to be like, I want 25 ideas about a ghost story that would appeal to 18-year-olds, and they'll put in various parameters. And then the AI will spit out probably relatively mediocre to bad scripts. But what it will do, it will cut out that stage of development for writers. And so Netflix could, have what's called in Hollywood a bake-off. They'll be like, we have this idea about a podcasting ghost, and we want to have 10 writers come in and pitch us ideas. And so the writers will pitch the ideas, and then Netflix will give them their AI script and be like, build off of that. So that will essentially cut the stage of development. And so it's just, again, it's coming for everyone, particularly in the professional writing fields. It's going to continue to get rid of stages of labor where people are paid. That's, I think, the big threat for AI when it comes to writing in Hollywood.
Well, some people have made the argument, they've made it on the show, Daniel, that AI might create more of a middle class.
That's wrong. We live in capitalism. I'm sorry, guys. Like, it's so ridiculous to me. All capitalists are going to do is cut labor costs.
So middle class and capitalism, those are antithetical. They can't work together. The argument is that the current winner-take-all system in Hollywood has resulted in certain Alina Smiths being superstar writers, and with AI, you'll have more teams. They won't get as much pay. They probably won't work quite as hard as Alina Smith, but they'll still be employed. Is that entirely wrong?
Yes. I mean, in unregulated, financialized, corporatized capitalism, the impulse is always going to be to cut labor costs. So they're going to have, instead of a writing room of 6 people, they'll have one person working on an AI script. I just think that is completely absurd and a total misunderstanding of capitalism, that AI is going to lead to a middle class. That's so wrong. It's so far wrong. It's not even wrong.
Probably it was Eli Lake who said it.
I mean, it's just such a naive understanding of the entire history of the last 100 years.
Let's move on then to fixes. So AI, you think, might help in some ways. The union's done a good deal getting some sort of deal for their workers. But what's the long-term fix here? Have you given up on Hollywood? Is it finished?
As I say in the article, could we curse on this or no?
Of course.
There'll always be shit to watch. As I say in the article, I do think, absent government regulation, you're going to need to have incredibly radical labor action of a type we haven't really seen in this country for about, let's just say, the late 19th century, where all the Hollywood worker unions, the WGA, SAG-AFTRA, the DGA, IATSE, come together and basically have a coordinated strategy to make Hollywood, the studios and streamers, again, absent government intervention. It should really be the government doing this, but absent that, to create a structure that allows for a middle class. I don't see that happening. I'm very pessimistic about the future of this country and the future of capitalism in the United States. I think it's just going to get worse and worse for everyone. And I think the white, just as the blue collar workers in the 60s and the 70s were canary in the coal mines, the writers and creatives are canary in the coal mines for basically everyone else in the political economy. So barring some sort of massive shift, I don't see things getting better in a real structural sense, and I'm focusing here on the structure.
As canary in the coal mines, the creatives, the Alina Smiths of the world, how should they be a warning to, you mentioned academics, lawyers, other professionals, other elites in the old capitalist technocracy of the 20th century? What's going to happen to them? Is their fate all that of Alina Smith?
Well, Elaine is doing well, but I think you mean general writers in Hollywood. Yeah, I mean, think about contracts, right? Contract lawyers. How much money is spent on lawyers going back and forth for hours and hours and hours to figure out a contract? What if you could just do that between 2 different AIs with different inputs? That's just the most obvious example, but things like that, I think, are going to be coming for the rest of the white-collar workforce. So maybe when the white-collar workers, and no one really cared that much when the blue collar workers were basically screwed by capitalism. The Democratic Party effectively abandoned them. Maybe the white collar workers will have enough cultural power to actually force things like, I don't know, a UBI or actual regulation. I'm very skeptical. Again, I think that capitalism might actually have escaped human control and human will, which again was what Marx predicted. But maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong.
So let's end with going back to that cover story you had last year of Harper's. Did that take you a year as well? What comes after the
No,
American?
that was not reported. So that was reading, just reading a lot, which I think that took about 5 or 6 months to put together.
So what kind of century is this going to be if we are to build our narrative off what you've reported from Hollywood, if it is indeed the canary in the coal mine, not just for the professional classes, but for the future of the 21st century?
So that article was particularly about the United States' foreign policy. Do you want me to talk about that, or do you want me to
Well,
talk
I'm
about
interested less in the foreign policy, but perhaps America's role in the world. I mean, America was always built around Hollywood, and
okay,
much
yeah.
of American cultural and economic power was derived from Hollywood. What becomes of America in
Yeah,
this
no,
new
it's a good
world?
question. I mean, I think you'll probably see major like what's already happened with China over the past 25 years, develop their own film industries, their own television industries. So there'll be less of a global marketplace. I wouldn't be surprised if there's American films operate, broadly speaking, within the global North as a whole. A lot of countries from Spain to I believe Ireland as well are offering significant tax incentives for people to film there. So I think you'll get the decentering of Los Angeles as a city, which has already happened, by the way, but the further decentering of Los Angeles as the city where Hollywood is centered, even if people, I think, in the entertainment industry will still be headquartered there, it'll be less and less over time. There'll be less work in Los Angeles, so that city is going to transform. I think movies are going to have to focus more on the domestic market. If you think about it, there are fewer and fewer studio comedies made, partially because comedies, quote unquote, don't travel. That is, they don't do well abroad. I think you might see a return to comedies. I think there's some IP fatigue. I think that after let's say 16 years, let's start it with Iron Man, but really since 1989's Batman, Hollywood has been increasingly focused on IP and less on original products. There'll probably be some sort of slight shift to original screenwriting. But I think that Hollywood will continue. It'll just be worse for everyone. And I think that's probably true for most of the American political economy. We'll slouch toward toward annihilation, as it were, as nothing is done about the climate.